Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. What happens when a neighborhood HOA messes with the wrong water line? I'm talking about a separate agricultural supply, old farm infrastructure, protected, documented, and not their property. But their new president saw my green garden and decided it was unfair. He tried to bill me, then threatened service interruption. I didn't pay. Then one day I walked outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. What was on my valve? I've lived on my 3-acre property for almost 12 years now, and for most of that time life has been pretty peaceful. The land used to be part of my grandfather's farm, back when this whole area was agricultural. Over the decades, the surrounding parcels got sold off to developers, and now I'm basically an island surrounded on 3 sides by a sprawling residential community full of identical houses and manicured lawns. My property is different. I've got old oak trees, a vegetable garden that produces more tomatoes than I know what to do with, and about an acre of fruit trees that my grandfather planted in the 70s. The whole thing stays green and lush because I inherited something most people around here don't have anymore. Agricultural water rights connected to the county's old farm irrigation system. It's a completely separate line from the residential water grid that the neighborhood uses. My setup is grandfathered in, protected by state agricultural preservation laws, and costs me about 1/10 of what residential water would run. The neighborhood next to me has a name that sounds like it was pulled from a luxury resort brochure, but I'll just call it what it is, an HOA community. And not just any HOA, this one has rules about everything. The exact shade of beige your house can be, how tall your grass is allowed to grow, whether your mailbox can have decorative elements. I've heard horror stories from people who live there about getting fined for parking their own car in their own driveway overnight. I'm not part of it, never have been, never will be. When the developers were buying up land in the 90s, my parents refused to sell. We kept our little slice of the original farm, and because of that, I'm completely independent. I don't pay HOA dues, I don't follow their rules, and I certainly don't answer to their board. That independence became a problem last summer. We'd been going through a drought, not the worst I've ever seen, but bad enough that the county had implemented water restrictions for residential users. People could only water their lawns twice a week, and there were penalties for violating the schedule. The HOA community's perfectly maintained grass started turning brown in patches. Some of the residents were clearly ignoring the restrictions and watering whenever they wanted, but enough were following the rules that the whole neighborhood started looking a little rough around the edges. Meanwhile, my property looked like an oasis. My garden was thriving, my fruit trees were healthy, and my lawn stayed green. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Agricultural water rights aren't subject to residential restrictions because farms and orchards are considered essential food production. I was following every rule, but I could feel the resentment building from across the property line. Then Richard showed up. Richard was the newly elected HOA president, and from what I'd heard, he took the job way too seriously. He was the type who drove around the neighborhood looking for violations, who showed up at board meetings with printed spreadsheets, who sent nasty letters to people about dandelions in their yards. He'd only lived in the community for about 3 years, but he acted like he built the place himself. I first noticed him one afternoon in July when I was out checking my irrigation system. He was standing at the property line with another guy, both of them staring at my land. When he saw me looking, he waved like we were old friends and walked over. He introduced himself and explained that he was the HOA president. He said he'd been reviewing the community infrastructure and had some concerns about the irrigation system along the property line. I told him that was fine, but my property wasn't part of the HOA, so whatever he was planning didn't involve me. He gave me this condescending smile and said something about how we were all part of the same community, whether we had official paperwork or not. Then he mentioned that he'd noticed my property stayed very green during the drought and asked where my water came from. I explained about the agricultural line. I kept it simple and polite. I told him it was a completely separate system from the residential grid, that it had been there since before the neighborhood existed, and that it was protected under state law. He looked skeptical but didn't push it. He thanked me for my time and left. I thought that was the end of it. 3 weeks later, I checked my mail and found something that made my blood pressure spike. It was an invoice. An official-looking document with the HOA's logo at the top, printed on thick paper addressed to me. The amount was $8,500. The description read, Mandatory Special Assessment for Community Irrigation Mainline Overhaul and Infrastructure Improvement Project. I read it 3 times trying to make sense of it. There was a breakdown of costs. New PVC piping, labor, permits, engineering consultation. At the bottom was a line item that said non-member administrative fee, adding another 15% to the total. The due date was 30 days out, and there was a note saying that failure to pay would result in legal action, including possible liens and service interruption. I figured it was a clerical error. Maybe they'd sent it to every address in the area by mistake. I called the management company number listed on the invoice and got a woman who sounded like she'd rather be anywhere else. I explained the situation. I said I'd received this bill, but I wasn't part of the HOA, so there must have been a mistake with the mailing list. There was a pause. Then she said she'd need to check the records and put me on hold. When she came back, her tone had changed. She told me the invoice was correct. She said the HOA president had specifically requested that it be sent to my address because my property benefited from the irrigation work they'd done along the property line. I asked her to explain how I benefited from work done on a system I didn't use. She said that according to Richard, the upgraded pipes increased water pressure in the area, which meant I was getting better service even though I wasn't paying HOA dues. She said it wasn't fair for me to get the benefit without contributing my share. I tried to explain again about the agricultural line. I told her I had my own separate water source that had nothing to do with their residential system. She said she was just passing along what Richard had told her and that I'd need to take up any disputes with him directly. Then she gave me his personal email and cell phone number and hung up. I sat there staring at the invoice trying to figure out what kind of logic Richard was using. Even if I had been connected to their system, which I wasn't, you can't just bill someone for infrastructure improvements they didn't agree to. That's not how any of this works. I sent Richard an email laying out the facts. I explained that my water came from a county agricultural main line, that I had documentation proving this, and that I was not connected to the HOA's residential system in any way. I kept it professional and assumed he'd made an honest mistake based on not understanding how the utilities were set up. He responded 2 hours later. His email was 3 sentences long. He said the invoice stood. He said if I wanted to dispute it, I could attend the next board meeting and present my case. He said the meeting was in 6 days and I was welcome to bring any documentation I thought was relevant. The tone was dismissive, like he was doing me a favor by even letting me speak. I decided to go to the meeting. I figured once I showed them the county records proving my water source, this would all get cleared up. I printed out copies of everything. My property deed showing the agricultural easement, the county water department records showing my connection to the farm irrigation main, the state agricultural preservation documents protecting my water rights. The meeting was held in the clubhouse at the center of the neighborhood. I'd never been inside before. It was exactly what you'd expect. Bland corporate art on the walls, folding tables set up in rows, a podium at the front. About 30 people were there, most of them residents who looked bored or irritated. Richard sat at the head table with 4 other board members. He was wearing a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on it. The meeting started with routine business. Someone complained about a neighbor's fence being 6 inches too tall. Someone else wanted to discuss the pool hours. Richard ran the meeting like a corporate executive, calling for motions and seconds, referring to the bylaws constantly. When they got to new business, Richard announced that there was a dispute regarding the recent special assessment. He gestured to me in the back row and said I had some concerns about the invoice I'd received. I walked up to the front and handed out my documentation. I kept my explanation simple and factual. I said my property had its own water source completely separate from the HOA's system. I said I had county records proving this. I said the invoice appeared to be based on a misunderstanding about where my water came from. Richard barely looked at the papers. He cut me off halfway through and said he'd reviewed my property records already and knew about the agricultural line. Then he said something that made me realize this wasn't a misunderstanding at all. He said that regardless of where my water connection originated, the fact was that his contractors had upgraded the pipes running along my property line. He said those upgrades had improved the overall water pressure and flow in the area. He said I was benefiting from that improvement whether I admitted it or not, and that meant I owed my fair share of the costs. I pointed out that I wasn't connected to the system they'd upgraded. He actually laughed. Then he said he knew I'd been using HOA water because my lawn stayed green during the drought while everyone else's was dying. He said the only way that was possible was if I was siphoning off their system. I started to explain again about agricultural water rights and drought restrictions, but he talked over me. He said he'd done his research. He said he'd consulted with engineers and contractors. He said they all agreed that my property was pulling water pressure from the community system. He said my refusal to pay was theft, plain and simple. One of the board members, an older guy who looked uncomfortable with the whole thing, asked if maybe they should get the county water department involved to verify which system I was actually using. Richard shut that down immediately. He said they didn't need to waste money on consultants when the facts were obvious. He said I'd been freeloading for years and it was time to pay up. I tried one more time. I asked Richard directly if he was taking official responsibility for the work done on the pipes along my property line. He looked at me like I was stupid and said of course he was. He said he'd personally overseen the entire project. He said the HOA owned and maintained all irrigation infrastructure in the community, and that included the pipes along the edge of my property. I asked him to confirm that for the record, since the meeting was being recorded. He got irritated and said yes, he was confirming it. The HOA was responsible for the irrigation system. I was using that system, and I needed to pay the assessment within 30 days or face consequences. I asked what consequences. He said they'd put a lien on my house. He said they'd take me to court, and he said if I still refused to pay, they'd shut off my water access. I looked at the other board members to see if anyone was going to point out how insane this was, but they all just sat there. A couple of them looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke up. I thanked them for their time, gathered my papers, and left. I wasn't angry. I was actually kind of amazed. Richard had just publicly claimed ownership and responsibility for infrastructure he didn't own, and explicitly threatened to tamper with a protected agricultural water line, and he'd done it on a recording. The next morning I called my lawyer. I'd used her before for some estate planning stuff, and I knew she had experience with property law. I laid out the whole situation and sent her copies of everything, including the invoice and a recording of the board meeting that was posted on the HOA's website. She listened to the recording and started laughing. Then she asked if Richard was really stupid enough to actually shut off my water. I said I didn't know, but based on how seriously he took his HOA responsibilities, I wouldn't be surprised. She said if he did, it would be the dumbest thing he could possibly do. She explained that tampering with agricultural water infrastructure was a federal offense in some contexts and definitely a state crime. She said water rights violations carried massive penalties, especially during a drought. She said if Richard touched my water line, I'd own his house. I told her to hold off on doing anything yet. I wanted to see if Richard would actually follow through on his threat. If he did, I wanted documentation. The 30 days passed. I didn't pay the invoice. I went about my normal routine, watering my garden, taking care of the fruit trees. Everything was fine. Then on day 31, I walked outside and noticed my irrigation system wasn't running on schedule. I went to check the valve near the property line and found it had been tampered with. Someone had installed a cap over my connection, completely shutting off water flow. I took photos from every angle. Then I called the county water department to report unauthorized tampering with agricultural infrastructure. While I was on the phone with them, I got an email from Richard. The email said that since I'd refused to pay my assessment, the HOA had been forced to terminate my irrigation access. He said this was a direct consequence of my failure to fulfill my financial obligations to the community. He said if I wanted my water restored, I needed to pay the full $8,500 plus late fees immediately. He'd attached a work order showing that he'd hired a plumber to shut off the connection. The work order had Richard's signature on it, authorizing the service interruption. I forwarded the email to my lawyer with a simple message saying he'd actually done it. She called me back within 10 minutes. She said Richard had just handed me everything I needed to destroy him. She said not to touch the valve or try to restore service myself. She said the county would handle that, and in the meantime, she'd start building the case. Over the next few days, everything moved fast. The county water department sent an inspector out to examine the tampering. He took photos, filed a report, and issued a notice of violation to the HOA for unauthorized interference with agricultural water infrastructure. He told me the violation carried a fine of $1,000 per day until the issue was resolved, plus potential criminal charges depending on how the county attorney's office wanted to handle it. My lawyer filed a formal demand with the HOA. It wasn't a lawsuit yet, just a letter laying out exactly what Richard had done wrong and what we wanted to make it go away. The letter demanded that the HOA provide documentation proving they had any legal authority to bill me for infrastructure improvements. It demanded they provide evidence that I was actually connected to their water system. It demanded they explain under what legal theory they believed they could shut off a water source they didn't own. Then it got to the good part. The letter explained that by shutting off my agricultural water line, Richard had committed several crimes: tampering with utility infrastructure, trespassing on private property, extortion, theft of services. The letter cited specific statutes and case law. It noted that agricultural water rights are federally protected in some contexts and that interfering with them during a drought carried enhanced penalties. The letter gave them 48 hours to restore my water service, pay for any damage to my irrigation system, and compensate me for lost crops. If they didn't comply, we'd file a lawsuit and report the criminal violations to the state attorney general's office. My lawyer sent copies of the letter to the HOA's registered agent, their management company, and Richard personally. The response came faster than I expected. The HOA's actual legal counsel, not Richard, called my lawyer directly. According to my lawyer, the conversation was short. The HOA's attorney had reviewed the situation and realized immediately how bad it was. He said Richard had acted without proper board authorization and without consulting legal counsel. He said the HOA would restore my water service immediately and cover the repair costs. My lawyer said that wasn't good enough. She said we wanted full compensation for the harassment, the extortion attempt, and the disruption to my property. She said we wanted all legal fees covered, and she said we wanted assurance that Richard wouldn't come after me again. The HOA's attorney said he'd need to discuss it with the board and get back to us. 2 days later, a plumber showed up at my property. Not a random contractor this time, but someone from the county water department. He removed the unauthorized cap, inspected the valve for damage, and installed a brand new upgraded valve at no cost to me. He said the county was billing the HOA for the service call and the equipment. That same day, my lawyer got a settlement offer. The HOA would pay $15,000 to settle all claims. They'd cover my legal fees. They'd issue a formal written apology acknowledging that I had no connection to their water system and no obligation to pay any HOA assessments. And they'd agree to a permanent injunction preventing them from ever billing me for HOA-related expenses or interfering with my water service again. My lawyer said it was a reasonable offer considering the alternative was a long lawsuit. She said we'd probably win more at trial, but it would take months and there was always some risk. I told her to accept it. The settlement was finalized within a week. I got a check, a signed agreement, and a letter on official HOA stationery admitting that the entire billing situation had been based on a misunderstanding of my property's water source. But the story doesn't end there. The county water department didn't drop its violation notice just because we settled. They'd already documented the tampering, and they had clear evidence that the HOA had interfered with agricultural infrastructure. The fines kept accruing at $1,000 per day for almost 2 weeks before the county officially closed the case. The HOA ended up owing over $14,000 in penalties. On top of that, the settlement they paid me, my legal fees, and the cost of the new valve put the HOA seriously in the red. Their reserve fund was depleted. They didn't have enough money to cover normal operating expenses, let alone the irrigation maintenance they'd been planning. So they did what HOAs always do when they run out of money. They issued a special assessment to all the residents. Every household in the community got billed for their share of the mess Richard had created. The amount varied based on property size, but most people owed between $800 and $1,200. And unlike the fake invoice Richard had sent me, this one was real and legally enforceable. The neighborhood lost its mind. People started showing up at board meetings demanding explanations. Richard tried to spin it as a necessary expense for community improvements, but someone had gotten hold of the settlement agreement and leaked it to the neighborhood Facebook group. Once people found out that the special assessment was entirely because Richard had tried to extort money from a non-member and then committed crimes to back up his threats, they turned on him. A petition started circulating to recall the entire board. Within 2 weeks, they had more than enough signatures. An emergency election was held, and Richard was voted out along with 2 other board members who'd supported him. From what I heard through people I know in the neighborhood, Richard tried to stay and tough it out, but the hostility got too intense. People confronted him at the grocery store. Someone put a sign in their yard visible from his house that said something about supporting recall efforts. His own neighbors stopped talking to him. He put his house on the market 3 months after the settlement and moved out of state. The new HOA board, desperate to rebuild trust with residents, sent me a formal apology that went beyond what the settlement required. They acknowledged that Richard had acted without authority and had created a financial disaster for the community. They promised they'd never attempt to claim jurisdiction over my property again. As for me, I'm still here on my 3 acres. My garden is better than ever. I installed some new drip irrigation using part of the settlement money, and my fruit trees produced a record harvest this year. I've even started selling produce at the farmer's market on weekends. Sometimes when I'm out working in the garden, I can see people from the neighborhood walking their dogs along the path near my property line. A few of them have stopped to chat and apologize for what Richard put me through. Most of them seem embarrassed about the whole thing. I don't hold it against them. They were just living their lives, following the HOA rules, trying to get by. Richard was the problem, not them. The irony of the whole situation isn't lost on me. Richard was so convinced that I was stealing from the HOA, so certain that he had the authority to punish me, that he never stopped to verify the basic facts. If he'd just contacted the county water department from the start, they would have explained that my property wasn't connected to the residential system. It would have taken one phone call to avoid the entire disaster. But he was too arrogant to ask. He assumed his position as HOA president gave him power over everyone and everything in the vicinity. He thought he could bully me into paying because who was I compared to the mighty HOA? That assumption cost him everything. His reputation, his position, his home, and probably a significant chunk of his savings given how much the whole mess must have cost in legal fees and penalties. I've got the settlement check framed on my office wall now. Not because I'm particularly proud of taking money from the HOA, but because it reminds me that standing your ground matters, that documentation matters, that knowing your rights and being willing to enforce them can make all the difference. And every time I walk past that frame, I smile, thinking about Richard sitting in his HOA president chair, banging his gavel, absolutely certain he was in the right, with no idea that he was about to destroy himself. The neighborhood's irrigation system, meanwhile, is struggling. The HOA can't afford to maintain it properly after paying out all the fines and settlements. They've had to cut back on watering schedules even beyond what the drought restrictions required. A lot of the lawns that used to be pristine green are now yellow and patchy. My property, though, looks like something out of a gardening magazine. The agricultural water line keeps everything lush and healthy. I'm following all the rules, using my legal allocation, maintaining my grandfather's legacy. Sometimes on hot summer evenings, I sit on my porch with a glass of iced tea and look out over my land. I can see the contrast between my green oasis and the struggling lawns next door. I can see the sprinklers on my property running on schedule while the neighborhood stays dry. And I think about Richard, wherever he is now, probably sitting in some new house in some new development, maybe already trying to join another HOA board. Still convinced that he did nothing wrong. I don't wish him ill. I hope he learned something from the experience, though I doubt it. People like Richard rarely do. They're so convinced of their own authority that they can't see reality even when it destroys them. As for me, I'm just glad to be left alone. I've got my 3 acres, my water rights, my garden. I've got peace and quiet and the satisfaction of knowing that when someone tried to bully me, I didn't just survive it, I won decisively. The whole experience taught me something important about dealing with people who abuse small amounts of power. You don't argue with them, you don't try to reason with them, you document everything, you know your rights, and you let them hang themselves with their own arrogance. Richard could have avoided all of this with a single phone call to verify facts before sending that first invoice. But he was so sure he was right that he never bothered to check. And that certainty, that absolute conviction that his position gave him authority over me, led him to commit crimes, cost his community tens of thousands of dollars, and ultimately destroy his own life. I didn't beat Richard, he beat himself. I just made sure there was a paper trail documenting his defeat. These days, when people at the farmer's market ask about my property and how I keep everything so green during the drought, I tell them about the agricultural water rights my grandfather secured decades ago. I explain how those old farm systems are protected by law, how they're separate from residential utilities, how they're part of preserving agricultural heritage, and sometimes, if they seem interested, I tell them about the time an HOA president tried to bill me $8,500 for infrastructure work on a water system I didn't use, then actually shut off my legally protected agricultural water line to enforce his imaginary authority. The reactions are always the same. Shock, disbelief, and then the question everyone asks, what happened to him? And I just smile and say he learned an expensive lesson about the difference between having authority and pretending to have authority. I say he learned that property rights matter, that utility law isn't optional, and that threatening people with consequences you can't legally enforce is a really bad idea. Then I usually change the subject and ask if they want to buy some tomatoes. Life's good here on my 3 acres. The water flows, the garden grows, and the HOA stays on their side of the property line where they belong. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So back in October, we noticed our drive-through drawer was slowing down, and the last time this happened, it basically meant it needed to be cleaned/lubed up again since we use it a lot. What we usually have to do to get any traction and action is submit a ticket online so it can be logged and hopefully worked on. Now I say hopefully because, well, the system is dog crap. You can submit tickets for anything for software issues, slowness with internet, physical issues that have to be fixed, etc. But getting some action for 80% of anything you submit requires some luck and hopefully getting someone who wants to help you out on the other end. To counter this and make things go smoother, we'd typically get in touch with management and they'd check in on the tickets as well, so it would hopefully get taken care of sooner and not get higher on the severity list, which then may lead to an emergency and extra billing. We did have a great assistant manager that I could talk with and work together on this, and we had great rapport, but he left early November because the new-ish store manager of a year basically drove out a lot of the old staff with severe micromanaging and cock-blocking them on promotions, and she was a stickler on costs on the store. We asked to get 2 keyboards replaced, and that was a headache as is. So since he was gone and it's just the store manager, I tried to talk to her about it and give her a heads up and was met with just submit the tickets and resubmit it if nothing happens. So just to make sure all was good, I copied the ticket numbers, sent an email, and copied my pharmacy manager on it. I made sure to resubmit the tickets and also ask, so you don't want me to tell you verbally or on email from here on about any ticket issues, pharmacy problems, or delays, correct? She replied back yes, and so I didn't. So back to the drive-thru. We had someone come out and check on the drawer. They said it would have to get looked at for replacement, so I made a ticket, put in all the info in that was needed, and submitted it. Didn't say anything, just let the people do their job they were supposed to do. Resubmitted every 48 hours as the systems allows you to bump it if nothing has been looked at, and did that for about 10 days with no action on replacement. Well, day 12 comes around and I opened that morning, and as I was taking care of someone, the shelf doesn't move, had to have them come inside to get finished up, and we had to shut down the lane. So by this point, since it's down and we really need some movement on this, we submit a ticket for an emergency to get this on the record and addressed. When a claim is done as emergency, we're basically guaranteed to get someone in there in about 2 to 4 hours. However, it comes with all the charges that would make a frugal manager flip out about, with fees, premium time costs for service, etc. And then ordering the parts was done automatically instead of needing the manager approval because the need was there. So you best believe when the manager got the heads up that an emergency claim was put in, she nearly ran over to the pharmacy to ask why we didn't tell her something was happening, and I gently reminded her that she said herself in an email to not bother her with issues and submit tickets accordingly, and since it had been almost 2 weeks and we now cannot operate efficiently, we now had to take this route. I think when we do emergency options, our district manager also gets an email, but I'm not sure. I didn't hear anything from him, though. The fallout was a huge bill for the store since the system we had to get replaced was from a company that initially put the system in when the store opened in the early 2000s. So they had to custom make this drive-through replacement because it wasn't the current model they produce, have multiple visits to prep for the install, and as a cherry on top, the store got to hear a lot of complaints about drive-through being shut down for so long, and if the scores don't look good there, bonuses get lowered too. I saw an invoice of some of the work and the guy who was working on things was chill, but I think he quoted the drive-through production around $25,000 because they had to put a rush on it, and that's not adding in the service fees and more. So a fix that could have casually be started at the first ticket and followed up on and finished sooner and for less cost ended up costing maybe 3 to 4 times the amount just due to the fees. Needless to say, the store manager has now conveniently asked me a few times here and there if there's any tickets in the system that need to be looked at. She's not my boss anyway, but that email chain is definitely saved in case it needs to be sent to our district manager if she thinks she can blame me for something in the future. Anyway, moral of the story is, take care of your crap early and listen to the workers and you'll save money. The next one is an entitled People Story. I've been friends with A for 15 years. We met in high school and been friends ever since, although on and off throughout the years due to her flaky personality. We are the complete opposite in terms of mindset, lifestyle, etc. After we finished high school, I was in college and built my career as a paramedic. She graduated high school and became pregnant with her daughter and was a SAHM. Safe to say her daughter's father and herself were really toxic and did not end well. She spent most of the time at the bar where she met her husband. She went on to have a daughter and recently had a son. Before I get on to the current situation, I want to give addition context that may be relevant to the situation. In our friendship, I was always the friend that worked, paid for everything, and helped her in any way I could. I helped raise her oldest daughter and supported her. She has never worked a day in her life and believes men should take care of her since that's how her mother raised her. She always relied on others to get around or to pay her way. She also was the kind of friend who would trauma and emotionally dump and talk about herself and issues all day, but wouldn't spare a second asking about how I was doing/going through. Now, with the current situation, I noticed she became quiet out of nowhere, and I was wondering if everything was okay. So I reached out 4 different times within 5 months' time, thinking maybe she will be busy or needs space. I texted her yesterday, just to check in on her and the kids, just to get a response if she's distancing herself from me, because 6 months ago she asked me to pick her and her mom up from the ER because she saw my location was in said city, and I told her I couldn't because I was about to leave back home to my town that's almost 2 hours away. She then proceeds to say it was a hard pill to swallow that I didn't care about her, all because I did not want to pick her up and because I didn't stop what I was doing to ask her questions about why she went to the ER. Mind you, I was with her and spoke to her every day with her recent pregnancy. I was aware of her health complications and checked on her every day. The one day I was handling a family emergency, which I explained in my response to her, she gets upset. She brought up me going on a date with my fiancé the day before and figured I was busy with him and said it pissed her off. She has been jealous ever since I started dating my now fiancé because I was giving him more attention than she liked. When she found out about my recent pregnancy, she started to project her issues onto me. She would say my fiancé probably will dump me now that I'm pregnant and my family would hate me. Safe to say, none of those things happened, and this upset her because her husband was upset about her recent pregnancy, and so was his family due to financial issues. She doesn't work, and him being a broker in the city, he doesn't have stable income to support her and 3 kids by himself. She proceeds to say she felt I wasn't happy about her pregnancy because I was honest about being a boy mom myself. I have a son from a previous relationship. I explained to her I was honest based on my experience and wasn't negative. I told her she was glorifying being a boy mom and saying really terrible things about her daughters in return. I proceeded to become upset because I didn't like how she spoke about her kids, I didn't like how she felt entitled to my time/energy, and her accusing me of being a bad person for telling her no, which she herself is not used to hearing from others. I told her instead of being immature, she could have been an adult and had a conversation. I ultimately expressed how I felt, and it ties. I had to vent somewhere, but the entitlement on her end that I endured all these years have finally boiled over. The constant paying her way, being her emotional dumpster, driving her around, being her built-in babysitter, and constantly enduring her relationship drama was too much. I ultimately blocked her after saying my piece. Anyway, thank you for watching.